Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very first live streamed webinar. This is my first try at doing one of these, and I hope you really enjoy it this evening, and I hope that you get something out of it. And if they work out as well as we hope they might, we'll try and make it a regular occurrence. What I'm going to talk to you tonight, of course, is about soft plastics, and in particular, giving you my 5-step formula for soft plastic success. As a lot of you will know, I was involved with my mate Bushy in originating the Squidgies range of soft plastics for Shimano Australia. We started working on those in the late 1990s, and they actually appeared on the scene in the early 2000s. I think it was about 2001, 2002 that we finally were able to launch the Squidgies. So you'll see that I'm wearing my Squidgy hat tonight, and I'm proudly a Shimano and Squidgies man. But don't worry, the stuff I'm going to teach you is going to be applicable no matter what style of soft plastics, what brand of soft plastics you use. You're going to be able to apply these 5 key strategies. It was a wonderful adventure for Bushy and myself to be asked by the late John Dunphy, who was the Australian boss of Shimano at the time, to design the Squidgies. We spent a couple of years doing it, and we finally launched the product. And I wouldn't be stretching things to say it absolutely changed the way Australians go fishing. Soft plastics had been around for a long, long time. A lot of people don't realise that they were actually around back in the late 1940s, early 1950s in the US, and they were even coming into Australia by the 60s. But they just never really took off. And I think a big part of that was because a lot of the plastics that we were getting in this country were actually designed for American largemouth and smallmouth bass. And not all of them worked as well as they might have on some of our Australian species. Anyway, around that time, Bushy and I were getting right into bream and estuary perch, things like we're holding there, and fishing in a lot of comps. And we designed the Squidgies to appeal specifically to Australian fish and to suit Australian fishing conditions. And it really seemed to strike a chord with anglers, and really Squidgy had the running to themselves for at least 5 or 6 years. There was nothing much else to compete with them, and then lots of other great brands came along, and there's lots and lots of really good soft plastics on the market today, and a lot of them are suited to Australian conditions. Squidgies are still there, but there's lots and lots of competition, and most of them are really, really good products. In particular, I guess I've made a thing out of targeting bread and butter fish, the things we can all go out and catch on soft plastics. Brim, as I said, were really important to Bushy and I when we were first designing them. We reckon that anyone that can catch brim on lures consistently can probably catch most other species without too much difficulty. So we figured if we could make lures that appeal to brim, then the other things would come relatively easily, and that has certainly proven to be the case. And one of the things I find most exciting about successful soft plastic fishing is all the species that 20 years ago we really didn't think of as regular lure fishing targets. Snapper and mulloway would be 2 at the top of that list. I mean, there were specialist anglers back in those days for sure, catching them on lures, but not very many people were doing it. And nowadays, a lot of people go out and target snapper and dewies and a whole bunch of other fish on soft plastics and do so very, very successfully. I've fished a lot, as you can imagine, with soft plastics over the last 20 years, probably more than any other style of fishing. I mean, I love my fly fishing. I love my hard-bodied fishing. I happily fish with bait, regularly fish with bait, but I probably fish with soft plastics about 75% of the time. And it's just because, well, they're fun to fish with, but they're also highly effective, and you can catch such a wide range of species on them. So let's get into my 5-step formula. And like all good formulas and things that you need to remember, I've come up with an acronym for it. And the word that I've come up with is FORCE, F-O-R-C-E. And the F stands for finesse, the O for observation, the R for rigging, the C for concentration, and the E for enjoyment, which we could also call positivity. So I'm going to work through these 5 steps tonight, and I reckon if you embrace these 5 steps and apply them to your soft plastic fishing from the very next time that you go fishing with soft plastics, you'll notice an improvement straight away. And then if you continue to apply these 5 steps over time, your catch rate should just go up and up, and you'll be able to use the force and become a Jedi warrior of soft plastic fishing. Seriously, It's amazing just how effective it is when you get it right. So let's dive into the first one, F for finesse. Now, finesse, I guess, is a bit of a totem of mine. It's something that I've hung my hat on for a long time. If I've got one particular philosophy in fishing, then it's finesse. And I think it gets misunderstood a little bit. A lot of people think it's just about using really, really light line or really, really skinny leaders. And that's part of it. It can be part of it. But there's a bit more to it than that. I like to sum it up in those words I've put underneath there: lighter, finer, longer, and smarter and simpler. By lighter, obviously I mean lighter line, if possible, the thinnest line that you can get away with for a particular application, the finest leader that you can get away with. You're always going to get more bites, no matter whether you're using hard-bodied lures, a frozen prawn from the servo, or a soft plastic. You are going to get more bites on a fine line and a fine leader than you are on heavier stuff. It's just a fact of life. And that goes right through to heavy tackle marlin and shark fishing. If you step down the leaders in your marlin lures from 400-pound mono to 200-pound mono, I'm not saying you'll double your strike rate, but there will be a significant improvement. More fish will hit your lures. So yeah, lighter and finer is definitely important. By longer, what I mean is staying a bit further away from the fish. And the whole idea of sneakiness and subterfuge come into all of this finesse thing in a big way. If we can stay that little bit further back from the fish, in other words, if we can fish to fish that don't know we're there, we have a much, much better chance of convincing them to take our lure. And that's as true with soft plastics as it is with any other style of tackle. The smarter, simpler thing is about minimizing all the junk between you and the fish. The simplest rig of all is often the best. If you can just tie a soft plastic to the end of your line, one knot between you and the fish, that's probably about the best system you can use. Now, I use braid as my main line about 95% of the time, so I'm not tying braid direct to my lure for reasons we can talk about tonight if we get time. I always add a leader of either fluorocarbon or nylon to the end of my braid, so I've got at least two knots. I've got the connecting knot between my braid, and I've got the knot attaching my leader to the jig head or the hook, whatever I'm running the soft plastic on. But that's about it. I don't have swivels, I don't have sinkers, I don't have snaps or clips if I can possibly avoid them. All that stuff reduces the finesse aspect of the presentation. So the simpler you can keep it, the better. I love my light tackle fishing. As I said, brim have played a huge role in my fishing over the last 20 years. They can be really, really tricky fish to catch on anything, but particularly on lures. And if you learn to be a good soft plastic fisherman for brim, you'll be catching things like that little snapper there is dead easy. I love my little reels, my light tackle, my light rods. I tend to use slightly longer rods than a lot of other anglers too. That's so I can cast a bit further. And it's also so that I've got a bit more line control. I can pick up the slack out of the line when I get a take from a fish. And because I do use braid, I like having that little bit of extra length in the rod to act as a shock absorber when I'm fighting the fish. So longer comes into it in terms of the rods too. And I do love my finesse tackle. So F for finesse is a really, really important part of the 5-step plan for improving your soft plastic fishing. But, and this is a big but, we need to remember that it is a balancing act. There's a thing that I call the finesse conundrum, and it simply means that if you go too light, you'll start to lose too many fish. As the song lyrics go, it's a fine, fine line between pleasure and pain, and none of us like losing fish. And if you go too light, you will start to lose fish. And in some situations, there's just no point in going light. If you're fishing for mangrove jacks or even Australian bass around heavy snag structure, or you're fishing for brim in the oyster leases or whatever, there's no point in going so light that you're going to lose every fish that you hook because it runs into cover and cuts your line. So you've got to balance it up. How fine can you go without starting to lose too many fish? But having said that, my first response in any tough fishing situation, if the fish are difficult, if they're shut down, if they're pressured, if you're fishing in an area that a lot of anglers are fishing in and nothing's happening, the very first thing that I'll do is downsize everything. I'll go to a thinner main line, a thinner leader, a lighter jig head, probably a smaller soft plastic. Downsizing has worked for me in so many situations over the years, but you can go too far, so bear that in mind. So F is for finesse. O is for observation, and I think this is a really, really important one. It's about being aware of what's going on in the environment around you when you're out there fishing. And this one helps to answer the question that I get a lot from people who get into soft plastic fishing. What soft plastic should I be using? What's the first tail I should put on? What's the first jig head I should tie on my line when I reach a fishing spot? Well, my answer to you on that is that you need to have a good hard look at where you're fishing. What are you fishing for? What's the water like? What's the terrain like? Really importantly, what are the likely food sources in that bit of water? And if you've got some idea about what that is, then you can start to do what we call match the hatch. Now, that's a bit of terminology that comes from fly fishing. Fly fishermen talk about observing the insects that are hatching or falling on the water at a particular time and then attempting to match those insects with their flies. That's where match the hatch comes from. And it's a really good rule of thumb. Now, you're not always going to be able to tell. You get to say you're fishing a totally new estuary system, you arrive there, you don't really know, particularly if it's in a different part of the world. If it's just up or down the coast, then the food sources that are likely to be most important there are probably going to be the same ones that are important to you in your home water. But if you travel interstate or to the other side of the country or even to another country, you might need to start all over again and really observe what it is that's living in that particular waterway that fish are likely to be feeding on. A great way to do that, of course, is if you do catch something and you decide to keep it, gut the fish and see what's in its stomach. That's a really good way of being able to match the hatch. But you also need to look in the shallows, see what's swimming around, what little bait fish are present there. Is there burrows in the mud flats that are likely to have been made by yabbies or worms or whatever? Turn over a couple of rocks and have a look underneath them. Always put them back afterwards the way that you picked them up, because lots of little critters live under there and they'll get killed if they're exposed to the sunlight. But have a look underneath the rocks. Are there crabs there? Are there little worms squirming around? If you're allowed to and it doesn't breach regulations, run a fine mesh net through the weed beds and see if there's any little shrimps, little tiny fish hiding in the weed beds, things like that. And once you've got a bit of an idea of what it is that the predatory fish in that area are likely to be feeding on, it's going to be a huge help to you when it comes to deciding what lures to use. That prawn there at the top left, that lure, of course, is a fair bit smaller than that prawn, but you'll see it's very, very similar in shape and colour, and you can work it with a very similar action to that prawn. The same with the little goby or gudgeon in the shot under that, similar in size to that squidgy wriggler, similar in colour. There's the stomach contents of a tuna down there in the centre. That I put in that monocled brim, that reef fish there in the middle, just to show you that sometimes the things that the critters are eating are going to be quite big, and they also could be quite brightly coloured. So think about all of those things. What colour, what size, what shape are the prey items likely to be that the fish you're hunting are feeding on, and try and match that with your soft plastic selections. So that's match the hatch. But there's another interesting thing that probably doesn't get talked about enough. This is particularly if you're struggling to identify what it might be that the fish are feeding on. Two things that I often do is match the water. So have a look at the colour of the water. If the water's green, sometimes green-based lures work really well. If the water's got a brown stain to it, brown or red lures. Tannin-coloured water, which is the colour of tea, can be from weak tea to quite strong tea, depending on how much tannin is in the water. That can be really, really suited to brown and red lures. I know a lot of you will remember the old killer tomato squidgies, not a colour that's not made anymore, but it worked particularly well in brown or tannin-stained waters. And when you looked at it in that water, when you put it in the water and looked at it, it looked completely different to when you had it out of the water and looked at it in the air. So think about things like that. And then matching the prey is an interesting one. Now, I've put a hard-bodied lure shot in there. That top left one is a mangrove jack on an old Tilson barra lure. But look how similar the coloration of the mangrove jack is to the lure that it was taken on. Similarly, the brown trout, the rainbow trout there down there at the bottom on the rainbow trout patterned lures. Often, if you've got no idea whatsoever, think about what the colours of the fish that you're chasing are and mimic those, because A, it'll recognise those colours. It's obviously got eyesight that's capable of detecting those colours because that's the colour that it is, but also most fish are cannibals. They'll eat small fry of their own species quite happily. So that can be a really good starting point too. All right, so observation is absolutely fundamental. Let's move on now. Oh, we've got a question there. What length leader and pound breaking strain to start with on bream? Yeah, that's a good question, Scott. My starting point usually is the finest braid that I can get away with, which is, it could be called 4 pound, it could be called 6 pound. Different manufacturers put different ratings on their braid. But the leader, I will usually start with 6 pound as my leader on bream. If they're still proving difficult to catch, I'll go down to 4 pound. If they're relatively easy to catch, I might go up. And if I'm losing fish, particularly around the oyster leases or structure or whatever, I'll go up to 10, 12. I've been known to fish 16 pound leaders on bream, particularly in the oyster acts, but 6 pound is a really good starting point. So yeah, that was a great question. Stinger hook, good idea for bream? No, I'm not a big fan of stinger hooks on soft plastics generally. I do use them particularly on dewies and barra from time to time, mostly because those are the sort of fish that you might only get one strike from a day and you don't want to miss it. So I will sometimes run a treble stinger, but I very, very rarely do on anything else, and particularly not on bream. People say, oh yeah, but they'll bite the tail, and I'm getting a lot of tail bites and stuff like that. Trust me, if you're missing a lot of fish on soft plastics and they're grabbing the tail of the plastic and pulling it down into the bend of the hook, there's 2 reasons for that. You're dealing with little bream that can't get it in their mouth, or you're retrieving your lure and striking too quickly. You're reacting too fast to the take. You're moving the lure too quickly. But 9 times out of 10, it's going to be the fact that it's a little fish in the first place. A decent-sized bream will have no trouble at all inhaling the sort of soft plastic that you want to be throwing at a bream. And most predatory fish, with the exception of things like tailor and Spanish mackerel and wahoo, the razor gang fish, but most of the other fish will try and eat anything they eat head first so that it goes down their gullet nice and smoothly. So they're going to try, if possible, to take your soft plastic head first from the jig head. So you don't really need a stinger hook back in the tail. All right. Do you think the gauge of the wire on the lead head jigs matters? What's important when matching jig head and hook gauge to squidgies or soft lures? These are really great questions. Yes, it is important. And again, it's a bit of a quandary or a conundrum. The finer the wire in the hook, the more fish you'll hook. There's no doubt about that. It's just easier to set the hook. A lot of times fish will hook themselves on fine gauge wire hooks. But again, it's a trade-off. You've got to be able to hold that fish, keep it away from a snag or whatever. So out in open country and on light tackle, I use the lightest gauge hooks that I can get away with in my jig heads. Once I start stepping up the tackle, increasing the strength of the leader, needing to tighten that drag up to keep the fish away from the snags or from bad cover, then I'll go to heavier gauge hooks. And in some scenarios, snapper over kelp reefs or whatever, barramundi up north, you almost can't find hooks that are heavy enough that they won't straighten out if you need to go white knuckle and lock that drag up on really a heavy line. Then you're going to straighten a lot of hooks. So it really is a matter of horses for courses. Okay, moving on in the rigging area, attention to detail is really, really important when you're rigging a soft plastic. And not only rigging it right on the hook, but then test swimming it first. And I'm going to show you a couple of little quick videos. I'll just I'll show you this. So probably the most critical thing of all with soft plastics is to rig them right in the first place. I've got a little jig head on here. It's only about 1.5, 2 grams. The lighter the jig head that you can get by with, the more fish you'll catch generally. You want that hang time in the water as the lure sinks. Now, the first thing to do is just to quickly measure up the soft plastic alongside the jig head and have a look where the bend of the hook comes back to, because that's where you're going to want the point to come out. Start right in the front of the nose, as dead center as you can get it, and then it's just a matter of sliding it round the bend, not unlike putting a garden worm on a hook. bring that hook point out at that predetermined spot and then slide the plastic all the way up. Now, that's pretty good, but I'm going to have a good look at it, make sure it's absolutely straight, give it a little tweak. One little trick is just to hold its nose there with your fingers and just give it a little bit of a pull just to straighten it out. And I'm really happy with that. I'll be even happier once I put some S factor on it. It doesn't make fish swim from half a mile away to eat your lure, but what it does is make them hang on to it when they do grab it. I'm still not going to just start fishing blindly with that. I'm going to give it a swim in the water first and make sure that it's behaving correctly. And I'm also going to have a think about what it is that I'm trying to imitate with this lure. It could be a worm, it could be a little prawn, it could be a crab or a bait fish. I'm going to tweak it in the water, watch what it does, and think about that when I cast the lure out there, because what I'm trying to do is put on a puppet show for the fish. And I've got my good wife, Jo, who's monitoring the chats tonight to thank for that analogy of the puppet show. It's something that she uses quite a bit when she explains to people about working a lure. And it's not just for soft plastics. It's for any style of lure or fly or natural bait. When you put that offering in the water, you need to think about what you're doing with the rod and reel to manipulate it and what you're trying to imitate. What you're trying to do is fool that fish. You're trying to convince the fish that the thing you've put in front of them is not only alive, but it's something that they recognize and something that they like eating. So that puppet show analogy is a really good one. Were there any other questions at the moment, Jo, that are worth diving in on? From Dan. Hi, Steve. What are your thoughts on trimming down the size of the soft plastic? Great question. And I do it all the time. I got a couple of plackies here. And quite often, like this is absolutely classic, a squidgy wriggler in bloodworm, probably caught more brim than any other single lure in Australia. I use them all the time. And I often take the scissors and just trim the front off the nose there, particularly if I'm using a jig head that's got quite a flat back on it, or a ball head jig like this one. I'll just grab the scissors and trim the nose off. And the other thing I'll do sometimes is grab the scissors and trim that dorsal fin off the back. That dorsal fin's lovely, but by trimming it off, you thin the profile down and you almost turn it into like a worm style soft plastic. Sometimes I'll take it one step further and even trim a little bit off the belly. So don't be afraid to modify your soft plastics to suit specific situations. The other thing is if they start getting a little bit ripped, if they're getting pulled down into the bend of the hook and the hole that they're going through is starting to get really loose, and you find that even just from casting, they're ended up slumped down in the bend of the hook, just take them off the hook, cut 1/4 inch, 1/2 centimetre off the nose and re-rig them again. And that means your hook will go through a different path in the plastic, come out at a different spot a little bit further back, and you'll get another life out of your plastic. So don't be afraid to use the scissors on your soft plastics. The old soft plastic on a jig head works for about 90% of our fishing, but there are certain situations where you might want to do something different. Rig it on a worm hook with a separate sinker, drop shot it. There's a whole bunch of different ways of presenting soft plastics for specialized situations, but there's a really simple way to make a soft plastic relatively weedless and snag proof when you rig it up, and you can do it on a standard jig head. I'll show you that because it's quite interesting. I'm using a heavy gauge jig hook with a light head. The thick hook resists straightening when fishing very tight drags, but it's absolutely critical that your hook point is sticky sharp. I constantly retouch my points using a little file or hook hone. I'll do this after every fish or after getting snagged. That point needs to grab your skin at the lightest touch. Okay, that's what I'm looking for, sticky sharp. Now, take your soft plastic tail. I'm using an old squidgy bug, but any curly tail's good. Push the hook point dead centre into its nose and bring it out the plastic's chin. Push the plastic right up the hook over the keeper and then rotate the tail on the hook like this. Next, spear the hook point up through the belly of the plastic, keeping it dead centre. Push the point up until it just begins to protrude from the back of the soft plastic, only enough so you can feel it with your finger. When a fish takes the plastic, you'll need to strike fairly hard to punch the point through and pin the fish. You can bring the point out a bit more to improve the hookup rate, but you'll also get snagged more often, so I like to keep it slightly concealed. And that's it, a relatively snag-resistant plastic. You'll go through a few tails, as their noses often tear when a fish is hooked, but you'll also pull fish from places where you never dared cast before. And how are those brim under those snags there at the end? And that's exactly the sort of place I'd throw a lure like that. Now, that probably looked a bit ugly, the way that lure was rigged. And it certainly doesn't swim as well as one rigged properly and nice and straight on a jig head with the hook point exposed. But if you're not retrieving it too fast, it's not going to spin out. It's not going to lay over on its side. And the most important thing is you can get it in there, get it down in amongst the snags. You'll still snag up with that rig, but nowhere near as often as you will with a fully exposed hook on a jig head. So that's a good one to keep up your sleeve for those really, really tough situations. What size and length of soft plastic is a good starting point? That's a bit like how long is a piece of string. It really does depend on what you're fishing for. But for brim, flatties, those kind of things, I like to keep it down to the sort of size of the bait that you'd be using. How big's a prawn for your brim? How long is a squirt worm? How big is a pilchard that you might be throwing, or a white bait for a flathead, or a potty mullet? So match your lures to the sort of things you would use as baits to catch those fish, and it's a pretty good starting point. With brim, I would definitely say that smaller is usually better, but you can go too small. It's funny, really tiny plastics I find are not as effective as that sort of. I mean, that's the 100 millimeter squidgy fish, and they're measured straight like that. So 100 millimeters sounds fairly big. It's 4 inches on the old scale, but they're not actually, they don't fish like something 4 inches long. But that's a reasonably big plastic, and yet that's probably caught more brim for me than any other soft plastic. The next size down, the 70 or 80 millimeter one, is a really good lure too, but it's amazing. It could be because I fish a lot for southern black brim down in these southern waters, and they don't mind eating a slightly bigger lure. But look, as a starting point, just try and match the size of the baits that you would normally use to catch the fish that you're targeting. Is a loop knot always needed for a jig head, especially for finesse fishing? This is another one of those ones that doesn't have a black and white answer. I tend to use a loop knot on any leader strength over about 10 pounds. So on my 6 pound and my 4 pound leaders, I don't go lighter than 4 pound. If I feel the absolute need to fish lighter than a 4 pound leader, I always have a reel with me with 2 or 3 pound fluorocarbon line spooled up right through, and I'll just fish that straight through to the lure if I need that ultra finesse. But that's probably only half a dozen times a year, usually in a tournament situation, that I might go to that. So 4 pound is usually the lightest I use. 4 pound I'll tie straight tight to the jig head. It's flexible enough that it won't affect the action. 6 pound I tie straight to the jig head. 8 pound usually. Once I get to 10, 12, 16, 20, and then up to your really heavy stuff for your dewies or your Murray cod or your barramundi, I'm definitely going to use a loop knot, because if you tie that heavier material straight to the jig head, often the jig head will sit off at a slight angle. It just kills the action a little bit. So I do prefer a loop. There's lots of different loop knots you can use. On the real light stuff, I just tie a uni knot, a standard uni knot, and tighten it down and leave about 1 millimeter or so of loop there. Pull really hard on the tag end, pull hard on the main line, and just leave that little loop there. Quite often when you hook a fish, it'll snug down tight, and that's okay. Once I get it in, I can either slide it back up with my thumbnail, or better still, cut it off and retie it, which is really good practice to get into anyway, retying after a fish, particularly on light line. So yeah, I'll use a little finesse loop on 8, 10, 12 pound, and then once I get up past your sort of 20, 30 pound leaders and up to your real heavy stuff, I'll use something like a Homer Rhodes loop or a Rapala loop, whatever you want to call it, and you can look all those up online. So yeah, they're really, really good. Mentioned not tying plastics direct to braid. What's the thinking there? Well, I don't ever fish braid straight to a hook, whether I'm using a hard body, soft plastic, or bait. It's a bit of an Australian thing, that, because a lot of the Americans do fish their braid straight through to their lures. There's 3 reasons why I don't do it. The first one is visibility. Even though braid is really skinny, it's not transparent or translucent, so line can't shine through it. So I think it's more visible to the fish than nylon or fluorocarbon. The second thing is abrasion. Now, braid's incredibly tough. It can be hard to cut even with scissors, but under tension, if you pull it backwards and forwards over a rock a couple of times, it'll break. It'll actually break more easily than fluorocarbon or nylon. So that's another reason I always use a leader. And the third reason that I always use a mono or fluorocarbon leader with braid is just to give myself that little bit of stretch in the system. There's virtually no stretch in braid, so it's nice to just have a little bit of spring, particularly when you get the fish close to the bank, close to the boat, close to the net, and you've got a very short length of line. If that very short length of line is all braid, there's no give in it at all. It can be very easy to pull a hook or have a fish shake the hook out. Just having that little bit of stretch in a rod length, a leader or whatever, is a great thing. So that's why I always run around a rod length is where I start. I'll go up to 4 or 5 rod lengths in really tricky situations, and sometimes I'll end up with only 50 centimetres of leader left if I've been changing lures all day, and that's not a really good thing to do. You should change your leader before it gets that short. But the only other time that I fish really short leaders, and in fact I could probably fish braid right through, is surface lure fishing, hard bodies on the surface or soft plastics on the surface. Because most of your line's out of the water, the visibility thing becomes less important, so I often fish quite short leaders. All right, let's get back into it. Where are we up to? We've done rigging. R was for rigging. C is for concentration. All right, now this I think is probably perhaps the most important one of the lot, and I think it's the thing that lets a lot of people down when they're soft plastic fishing. You really do need to concentrate on what you're doing. The first thing you need to do is slow down, and I can tell you that nearly everybody, including me, fishes their soft plastics too fast. And the time when you're most likely to fish them too fast is when you're a bit pumped yourself, or you just had a follow from a big fish, or you just had a massive strike, or you hooked a fish and lost it. Your pulse rate goes up, and so does your retrieve rate. So just consciously try and slow down. It's almost impossible to fish soft plastics too slowly. They will actually get eaten just sitting on the bottom, and they get eaten all the time, sinking down through the water column. So slow right down, give the soft plastic enough time to work. Visualize what the lure's doing in the water. That comes back to putting on the puppet show like we talked about before. Slow down some more, and then react. And this is probably the most important of those 4 keys there, although slowing down is pretty important too. But reacting when the fish takes the lure is the difference between catching an occasional fish or only catching flathead on soft plastics. Flathead are easy because they grab it and hang on to it. And usually you go to wind in and, oh, there's a fish on there. And that's why most people, their first fish on a soft plastic is either a tailor or a flathead. Brim, on the other hand, will come up, suck that soft plastic in, taste it, spit it out faster than you can possibly believe. And what will happen a lot of times is you'll just see a little tick in the line. There'll be the slight belly of line between the rod tip and the water while you're working that soft plastic. And Bushy used to describe it as a gnat flying into the line, and it's a good description. You just see a little flick, and that little flick could be a 1.6 kilo brim that's just sucked your plastic in, and it's just about to blow it out again. Sometimes you get lucky, and when it goes to blow it out, if your hook's nice and sharp, it hangs up on the lip of the fish or it gets caught behind their teeth. You feel them, you react, you set the hook. But if you're not watching that belly of line, you are going to miss a lot of fish. I'll show you a video now and talk you through a cast and retrieve with a soft plastic. Have a look how I work the soft plastic, and just in particular study the way that I'm going fairly slowly and that I'll have lots of lifts and drops. I'm just going to talk you through a cast and retrieve with a soft plastic now. And it begins by me either casting it as far as I can or as close to structure as I can. And in this case, I'm working structure. So I'm going to get it in there close to that snag. That's not bad. Get it onto the bottom. It's very shallow in there, so it doesn't take very long. Make contact. And then it's just little lifts and drops, and everyone's got their different style for working a soft plastic. Some people like a little double hit, some like a triple hit, some just do a single lift and a drop. It's really whatever works for you. And some days the fish want a particular style of retrieve. So experiment. Fish it all the way back. Because I'm fishing structure here, I would normally fish it out about halfway and then just retrieve it in with a steady retrieve. But if I was out in open water, I'd work that plastic all the way back to the boat, and it'll often get eaten right here. Yeah, so really, really important to usually let it get to the bottom first. There's some situations where you might not want to do that if it's really snaggy or the fish you were targeting were higher in the water column. But for the vast majority of fish that we're chasing on plastics, you want to begin your retrieve with the soft plastic on the bottom and then lift and drop. Keep it going up and down through the water column. When they're on these lead head jigs, they swim going down through the water. That's a really important thing to remember. That plastic is actually swimming all the way down as it follows that jig head to the bottom when you're letting the lure sink. And that's the time when it most often gets taken by a lot of fish, bream in particular. Let me show you a little video about that. A little bit of a northeasterly breeze blowing in my face here, so I'm going to have to punch into that. Most important thing is to get the plastic onto the bottom first. It's well and truly on the bottom now. And then I just make contact with it and start doing little hops. And I'm watching that belly of line like a hawk. Yep, there we go. First cast. That's nice. That was this really, I wouldn't say a soft tap, it was sharp, but it was very, very light. It was just a distinct tap. And that is so often what you get with bream. Oh yeah, it's a nice one too. Oh, might have a little bit too much drag on there. Oh, cracker. Oh, he's not done. Wow. There's such good fish, big bream. They go so hard. I'm going to back that drag off another couple of clicks. You see what I meant about how slowly and methodically I was working that soft plastic, not lifting it very far off the bottom, just hopping it, making contact with it again. And it was on the drop after one of those hops, and I had to actually set the hook. Might have only been a tick, but he got it well in. Look at that. A good 1.1, 1.15 kilos. And look at that. Absolutely inhaled that soft plastic. And that's what happens when you fish it lift and drop like that. Because it's dropping down through the water, they're able to just suck it in. And that's that tick you feel. It's a really sharp little suck. And then their mouth closes on it. And you've got about half a second to react, or 9 times out of 10, they're going to spit it out again. And I reacted by setting the hook. And that is the result. And that is how easy soft plastic fishing can sometimes be. Not always. That was literally the first cast. And you can see by the way that that fish took that that lure, and that's how the big bream take them. They just suck them right in like that. You don't need a stinger hook. You wouldn't get it out if it had a stinger hook in it. So it's all about watching that belly of line as the lure drops down through the water column on those lifts and drops, and develop your own style. You know, everyone I've fished with fishes slightly differently. I'm a bit of a double hopper. I remember Chris Slick-Wright, who's done really, really well in the ABTs and so on over the years. He was triple, and some people just do a single hop. It doesn't really seem to matter, although some days one of those will be much more effective than the other. So it pays to experiment with different styles. Sometimes just slowly retrieving will work too. Just a slow roll through mid-water sometimes will catch fish. But 9 times out of 10, it's all about that lift drop. Have we got any questions in the pipeline before we move on from concentration? Do you think scent makes a difference when plastics are sitting on the bottom and moving slowly? How good is that S factor, and does it actually work? Yeah, yes to all of that. It not only makes a difference when it's sitting on the bottom, but yeah, when you're fishing it slowly, I think that's when scent has its biggest impact, is when you're fishing slowly. I also think it's really important in dirty water or low light conditions if you're fishing at night. And yes, you can catch fish on soft plastics at night, but if you're fishing at night, I think scent is really important. dirty water, as I said. Cold water is another place where scent really seems to come into its own, and those slow presentations. I mean, if you were throwing plastics and cranking them fast for tuna and things like that, I don't think any scent would make all that much difference. But when you're working them slow, it definitely does. And as I often say, it doesn't make the fish swim. It doesn't even make them swim 10 metres to eat your lure. But if they're close to it and they're looking at it and they get a whiff of a decent scent like S Factor, there's a much better chance that they will actually pick it up. And then there's a much better chance that they'll keep it in their mouth a bit longer than that suck in and blow out thing that I talked about before. If it tastes right, if it stimulates all the right taste buds, they're far more likely to hang on to it. And I've had flathead in particular come back to lures with S Factor on them 6-7 times before they hook up. And you don't see that very often on unscented lures. So yeah, I think it does work. S Factor isn't just a marketing exercise. We put a boffin, Dr. Ben Diggles, back when in the squidgy days, he spent months working on that. And his background, by the way, was in aquaculture in New Zealand. And what his job was to make the snapper in the cages eat antibiotics. Sometimes they'd get an outbreak of disease in one of the floating cages or one of the tanks, and he'd have to get them to take these little antibiotic pellets, and they didn't want to eat them. It didn't taste good. So his job was to come up with a coating that he could put on the antibiotic pellets that would make the snapper eat them in the tanks. And that's basically where S Factor came from. So yeah, it does make fish hang on to things that they might otherwise spit out very quickly. So I do. It's a confidence thing too. Yes, I'm a big fan, and it's helped me no end in my fishing adventures. I'm curious as your thoughts on how often to reapply it, and can you apply it too much? Well, there's actually times when I don't use it, particularly if I'm having trouble with things like toadfish or leather jackets. I stop using S Factor because they just eat the bejesus out of your lures. They come in with completely chewed up. So there've been times when I've had to stop using it. As for how often to reapply it, I don't do it all that often. I usually do it after a fish. I definitely do it when I put a new lure on. If I put a new plastic on, I'll put some on straight away. And I don't put a hell of a lot on either. I only put a little smear on and then just rub it all around the lure with my fingers. And I make sure I put some on the jig head and the hook as well. Anything that I might have touched, if I've got sunscreen or fuel or whatever on my hands, even if I don't know that it's there, the fish will probably sense it. So I do it then when I put a new plastic on. I do it after a fish. I'll do it sometimes after a snag or whatever, just because I think of it. And the other time I do it is when I haven't caught anything for ages. You're just thinking, what am I doing wrong? And you've been fishing for 2 hours and you haven't had a hit. And I cannot tell you how many times I've put it on and within the next 3 casts I've had a hit. And that's what tells me that it's more than just hype, that it actually does work on its day. It can make a big difference. Should you be using fluorocarbon all the time? Plastics? Look, I don't. To be totally honest with you, I don't think there's a massive difference between nylon and fluorocarbon. A lot of people make a big issue out of it. Fluorocarbon's a little bit harder to see in the water. Its refractive index is closer to 1, which is the refractive index of clean water. So theoretically, it should be a little bit harder for the fish to see than nylon, which is like 0.8 or something like that, which is why nylon tends to float a little bit, whereas fluorocarbon sinks a bit more. Look, whatever you want to use, I use fluorocarbon nearly all the time. I love the Shimano Oshia fluorocarbon, and I've been using it for years now, and it's never, touch wood, it's never failed me. I've never had a bad batch. I've never had mystery bust off with it or bad knots or anything like that. So I trust it. And that's something we'll come to in E for enjoyment, because there's a bit more in that than just enjoyment. But yeah, look, fluorocarbon's good, but so's nylon. And fluorocarbon's expensive. If you just want to use nylon, plenty of fish get caught on nylon leaders. Can you use fluorocarbon meant for straight through applications as leaders because it's thinner than a fluorocarbon leader? Yeah, absolutely. So the stuff that I use for my straight through applications is actually leader material. I use a lot of that FC Rock and some of those the shooter and the sniper, those Japanese ones, 2, 3, 4 pound. I'll usually have either 3 or 4 pound on at least one reel in my kit particularly if I go away on a tournament or whatever, and I think I might need to use fluorocarbon right through. That's the only stuff that you can buy on sort of 100 or 150 metre spools. Most of the other fluorocarbon just comes on 20, 30, 40, 50 metre spools. So that's one of the reasons I buy that stuff, and it seems to be really good. Fishing fluorocarbon straight through is a whole subject in itself. I am not 100% sure why it works as well as it does, but it can have its day. It's won me a few tournaments over the years, or elevated me from low positions in the ladder to near the top. Particularly fishing out in deeper open water for really finicky bream, it really, really can make a difference. And I just think it behaves differently in the water. And I also think that because you don't feel as much through it, you tend not to react as quickly, so you don't pull the lure away from the fish. I don't know, there's a couple of things going on there, but it can have its day. Best not to join braid to leader. I started off using double unis, and I will happily revert to a double uni out in the field. If I bust off, I usually just tie another double uni, but I'm a big fan of the FGs these days. But it takes me about a minute and a half to tie a decent FG, and that's if I'm not shaking after just having lost a massive fish. So I don't always tie an FG out in the field. I will often tie a double uni. But either of those two, Slim Beauty's a great knot too. I did use that for a while. I think the FG's a slightly superior knot to the Slim Beauty, and a slightly superior knot to the double uni. There's probably not a lot in it in strength between the a well-tied double uni and an FG, but the FG is definitely skinnier going through the guides. If you get the FG right, you don't even feel it going through the guides on the casts, and that's really, really important in finesse fishing. You cast further, and you have less hang-ups in the guides and things like that. So yeah, definitely not an easy knot. It took me quite a while to learn to tie the FG, but I'm glad I can do it now. Keen to go weedless when chasing barra, but concerned about the hookup rate. Do you mind explaining how implosion feeders expose the hook from the plastic if they're not biting down on it? Yes, very good point. And I'll tell you right up front, any weedless presentation, no matter how good it is, you are going to miss fish on it. You're going to miss more fish on it than you will with an exposed hook. There is no doubt about that. Sometimes you'll miss a lot of fish on it, but you're also putting your lure in places you could not possibly put it with an exposed hook. So you're getting bites that you wouldn't have got otherwise. So it's that trade-off thing again. I wouldn't fish weedless or snag proof out in open water. There's just no point in doing it, and you are going to miss some fish. With things like implosion feeders, and it's a really good point, they just go, boom, suck the whole thing in and boom, blow it back out again if it doesn't feel right and it doesn't taste right and everything. So how are you going to set the hook? Well, you've got to be on the ball. You've got to know when they've sucked it in, and you've got to set that hook. You've got to strike. I mean, the Americans take it to a ridiculous extent when you see them striking on their largemouth bass and that sometimes, but seriously, you've got to whack them pretty hard. And if you can see the fish, that's a real advantage, because you can whack it away from the direction that it's facing. So if it comes towards you and takes the lure and goes that way, you're better off to strike the other way. But a lot of times, obviously, you can't see what's going on. So you're probably best just to strike straight up and hope that you drive that hook through and into the roof of the mouth or around the lip of the fish. In a perfect world with those implosion feeders, you would wait half a second after that tick. And I mean literally half a second. It's not even it's not a full second. It's just a momentary wait and then whack. And that just allows them to clamp down and hopefully start to turn away. And you get a much better hookup rate that way. It's pretty hard to get yourself to do it, though. You'll either react too quickly or not fast enough, depending on the situation. But on barra, in weed beds and dense snags and stuff, we used to fish from a lot up in the territory with snag proof. And yeah, you probably miss 2 out of 3. But you're still, at the end of the day, you've caught more fish than the people that were fishing out in open water with exposed hooks. So it's a trade-off. Keeping in contact with the bottom when hopping the lure is important. Yeah, it depends on the species. It's really important with flathead, for example, because a lot of times flatties won't come very far off the bottom to take your lure. So you want to be making repeated contact with the bottom throughout the retrieve when you're fishing for flathead. But dewies, for example, I start with the lure on the bottom, but I don't really care if it doesn't touch the bottom again through the retrieve. I don't mind if it's I like it to be somewhere in the bottom third of the water column, but it doesn't have to be going all the way back to the bottom every time, unless I'm also looking for a bycatch, a flathead, which can be a real bonus when you're targeting dewies. But dewies will happily, now they swim along a metre or two off the bottom and they'll happily come up for a lure, so you don't have to be going back to the bottom all the time. Should we also fish the bottom in freshwater lakes for trout? Now, trout are an interesting case in point. The lift drop thing is less important on them, I find. I still like to let the lure sink to the bottom to start with, but the retrieve that I most commonly use on trout is just a slow roll with an occasional pause. So I'll just wind, stop, watch the belly as it sinks, but not all the way back to the bottom. Just let it drop a metre or so, then wind again, wind, drop, just let it go down that metre again. And they'll often, when they seem to take it most often, is just as it starts again after one of those pauses and drops. I reckon they follow it down, and then as it takes off again, they grab it. I miss a fair few trout on soft plastics. I reckon I miss more trout than a lot of other species, and they're probably something where a stinger would be handy, because they do tend to come in from behind and grab the lure, and they nearly always grab it while it's actually moving. So they can be a little bit problematic on soft plastics. That said, in streams, casting up current and hopping it back down with the current can be a really deadly technique for stream fishing for trout. That retrieve I was talking about before, the slow roll with the pauses, is more in lakes or big bodies of water. But in a stream, I'll fish it just like a hard-bodied lure. I'll cast it 45 degrees up and across the current, get it down to the bottom, and then lift, drop, slightly faster than the current coming back down. You catch a lot of trout that way. What technique for when it's windy? It's hard, and you miss a lot more fish in the wind. So you just got to try and keep that belly down to a minimum. Quite often it means putting the rod tip down closer to the water, not in the water, because you still want to see that belly. But if it's blowing out to your right or your left because of the wind. I've caught fish by watching the twitch, even in a big belly of line. You watch the back of that belly and you'll still see that twitch, even though you're a long way from ever being in contact with that lure. You'll still see that belly of line do that little thing at the back. And you've got to strike harder because you've got to lift the belly out as well and set the hook. Wind is not your friend when you're fishing soft plastics, that's for sure. Let's move on from concentration and go on to E for enjoy. Now, this might seem like a strange one. Of course, you're going to enjoy yourself if you're catching fish on soft plastics. It's really more about having confidence, I reckon. You need to believe that you're going to catch fish on soft plastics. And I think that's a big step for a lot of people. When they first get started in soft plastic fishing, they go, I see all these photos in the magazines and YouTube and on social media and everything of these guys with fish on soft plastics. Do they really catch them on the soft plastics? Well, yeah, they do. These things really, really do work. You've got to believe that, and you've got to be positive. It's amazing how much difference a positive attitude will make to your fishing with soft plastics or anything else. Part of that too is to celebrate your victories. When you catch your first brim on a soft plastic, it's a big deal. And I don't care if it's 20 centimetres long. I know so many people who've caught heaps of flathead on soft plastics, heaps of tailor. They're still waiting for their first brim. So celebrate that victory. When you catch that first brim, you've joined a club. It's not an elite club anymore. Plenty of people have done it, but it is still worth giving yourself a bit of a pat on the back. And above all, just have fun with it all. It's a great way to fish. I still get a buzz to this day every time I fool a fish into eating one of these things. I guess I just celebrate the fact that I'm smarter than an animal with a brain the size of a pea. But, it just gives me a buzz catching them on soft plastics. It's just a really, really nice way to catch fish. And it doesn't matter if you're up north chasing things like barra and sooty grunter and big golden snapper and long-nosed emperor, like in that photo there, or down south on your brim and your dewies and your flatties. It's just a magnificent way to catch fish. And it is highly effective. And as I said before, it's turned a lot of species that we didn't used to think of as regular lure takers into regular targets. So just to recap, the force, may the force be with you: finesse, observation, rigging, concentration, and enjoyment. And I reckon if you put those 5 together, you will succeed. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Really appreciate you taking the time. And if you're not already a fan and a subscriber to my Starlo Gets Real YouTube channel, make sure you jump on there, because I do a lot of this kind of stuff on there as well. Really appreciate having you guys on board, guys and girls. Thanks so much.